grew up in England, outside of London, near Windsor, where the Queen lives. And I had a kind of an idyllic upbringing. We lived in a small cul-de-sac of 10 houses. There was 15 kids our age amongst those houses. We played on bicycles. It was kind of in the middle of the countryside as well, in a small village. So I had a perfect upbringing, and then kind of uprooted and moved to India when I was 11 years old. It was a massive recession in 1980, something like that. And Dad decided, my father's from India, that we'll try our luck and move there. We came back 18 months later, realizing that we were never going to fit in there either. Of me being happy outside my comfort zone, and also the experience of life itself as a journey, and travel. It's in my blood. My father traveled to England when he was 19 or 18, and then traveled back to India overland with 4 people in a van. Ended up in prison in Turkey, then in Iran because their visas ran out. All sorts of drama, and he wrote about it for an Indian newspaper. And my mum was a Dutch au pair, and they met on a blind date in Birmingham. So travel, adventure, and living outside my comfort zone has been kind of dear to my heart all the way through. Dad was Indian, kind of typically status driven. He was probably more scared of failure, but I saw a lot of failure around me. So I would keep an eye on failure and then make sure it didn't happen, was something that I learned. Also, the other thing is, like, that group of 15 kids, they were all like captain of every single team, swimming for the county, playing cricket for the county, playing football. And I was never able to compete with them. So I learned that the only person I could compete with was myself. So from a youth, I was never a competitive person with others around me, just with myself. I knew I wasn't as good as them and accepted that. But I don't know, somehow it gave me the intrinsic motivation for kind of life itself, that yes, it is a team sport, but it's not really. In the end, the buck stops with you, and you have to make your own success and luck, And so, yeah, I don't know, but it's so badly ingrained in me that I can't even bear playing board games. Just can't stand it. Don't play card games, none of it, because I don't like the competition. It's about competition against other people, particularly people that you're, friends or those close around you, that it doesn't motivate me. I don't mind the competition of myself against the markets or whatever it is, where it's kind of faceless and you're trying to figure it out and it's based on you. But yeah, I'm just not a competitive person, which is, people find hard to believe, but I'm not. So my dad was in marketing. So he was like European marketing director for Xerox. He was in the copying machine industry, which at the time was the fast growing, sexy tech industry. And so he was in marketing, but I was a kid of the 80s, right? I grew up on my bicycle around the 80s and would see the rise of, people with red braces and Porsches and champagne and the 80s thing, but notice that this massive new wealth that accumulated, the Thatcher years. And so when I was interested in finance, I was reading about it because it felt like it was cool to me. Much like people might read about startup and entrepreneurial life now, because you're dreaming about what your future self is. But I also liked marketing, understood it. And it was actually after university, I did economics and law at university, but tried to do as much financy stuff as possible, but also was focusing on marketing. And it was the only university that would accept me, by the way. So, I was speaking to a friend of Dad's birthday, and he said, "Raoul, what are you going to do?" And I graduated in 1990, which was a recession, which was a terrible year to graduate. And I said, "Well, I'm interested in marketing, and I've been interviewing. I've got at home, still got 100 rejection letters from all the companies I wrote to, many of who I worked for later. But, I was interviewing at places like Gillette, and I wanted to do marketing. And I couldn't get any interviews at banks, but that was the other thing. And I said to this guy, I said, I'm thinking about marketing or finance. And he looked at me and said, really simple, Raoul. He goes, you can go and work for a great marketing company like Mars, and they'll give you free Mars bars. Or you can go and work for a bank, and they'll give you free money. Right? You're doing basically sales or marketing. And so, but one pays a lot more. And so that's how I ended up. I'm a big believer in manifesting your own destiny. I kind of see it and then make it happen. And so I just made it happen. And I got there eventually, fought my way in, went through circuitous routes, started at a company called Telerate, which was like Bloomberg at the time. In fact, it was a training program there. I then got promoted to a salesman really quickly, and then focused on getting into a trading desk. And I went to a company called James Capel, which was a very kind of posh brokerage house that was part of HSBC in equity derivatives. And then my boss resigned 6 months later, and I became the boss. That was that. When I first started my career, the old boy network, the English class system was very prevalent, and it was a very posh firm. So there was a lot of very posh people who went to very posh schools. And it was kind of gentleman's club. So when you got promoted to a certain level, you get a club membership paid for by James Capel. It was that kind of firm. And my impression of the dealing room was obviously overwhelming, but the adrenaline, even when I look back now, it was like, you're like a battery hen. It was chaos, loud, engaging, terrifying. And it was also a foreign language. So you'd sit there, and I knew a bit about finance, but I was like, what the hell is going on? These things, prices moving on the screen. You couldn't really focus. What do they mean? Why were they going up and down? And then, eventually I actually discovered charts, and charts were my visual cue. Some people are very visually driven, and I'm very visual. So charts helped me with that. But as I progressed in my career and I transitioned to NatWest and then eventually to Goldman, it was a whole different world. It was, yes, there was a bit of background element, but then it was about how smart you were. Much more competitive, much more ruthless, fast-paced, entrepreneurial, but also restrictive in different ways.
Yeah.
I did my whole career in investment banks as a salesman. So I rode the wave of derivatives, and I was an equity derivative guy. So, the S&P futures and all of that were the start, stock options, index options, and then it grew. And, I was one of the people who started the sector swap business in Europe. So, we trade sectors in the US that didn't exist in Europe. And I and a couple of hedge funds got together and created a market for this stuff. And I rode this huge wave. And in the middle of that, I started discovering that I spoke the language of hedge funds, and that was the area I focused on, and I really liked it. So then I became the hedge fund guy in Europe. So I became the kind of European hedge fund guy. And again, I just manifested it. That's what I wanted to be. And I was at NatWest, and I was the head of the desk, and I was moving a whole team from James Capel because they had failed to pay us a bonus when we had a great year. And we're like, fuck that, we're off. So the team was moving across, and just as we were about to start work, the new boss at the time said, big change here. NatWest had just hired 120 people from Morgan Stanley, the equity derivatives team. And this was the world's best equity derivative team. They're coming to NatWest. And I said, well, what does it mean for me? Because I have no idea what it means for any of us. But it's going to be a change because we're going to turn from being a British investment bank to an American one. And it's going to happen fast. And my new boss at the time, a guy called James Goldsmith, who was pretty famous in the industry, he was the hedge fund guy. And I was already speaking to some hedge funds. I was, started building a hedge fund business, but I was more of a generalist in my client base. And Rick said to me, listen, Raoul, your job of head of European equity derivatives doesn't exist anymore. I'm like, great.